Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
I was just commenting before we kicked off that you've got a much sexier background than me, all the surfboards. I've just got a plain old white door, mate, so you've won that battle already.
Oh, it's easy, mate. You just go down and hire a few surfboards from the local surf shop and you just look like a surfer. Just put them up in the background as props.
Sounds like a plan, mate. Sounds like a plan. So I imagine you'd be quite happy now that the beaches are open again.
Yeah, I mean, I was so lucky because I've moved to the Gold Coast from Sydney a couple of years ago, and they never actually closed the beaches for surfing. You could surf the whole time.
Yeah.
So for me, and I feel bad saying this because things changed a lot, but the main things in my life were kind of all the same. So I think I had it pretty easy to a lot of people who were going through big struggles, and to take like all those different like outdoor activities away from people is mind blowing. It's crazy. Well,
I was telling a lot of people, you're introverted when there's a pandemic, you're in isolation, and your life doesn't change at all. So,
that's exactly what I feel. I feel like it was in some ways almost better. I was like, there were all these like parties and occasions and everything that my wife kind of had planned. It was like I didn't have to go to any of them. I was like, this is heaven.
Awesome. It's so true. Like there was absolutely no fear of missing out during that period. It's like you could just focus on.
So true. Tough if you're an extrovert though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So are you over near Kira nowadays, or whereabouts in the Gold Coast?
Yeah, right in Coolangatta, and I basically my flat looks over the top of Kira and Greenmount Point Break, so it's
beautiful. It's
the ideal location for a surfer.
Yeah. So yeah, for the non-surfers listening to this, that's one of Australia's most iconic surf locations. That Bells Beach, Bondi, that's pretty much three of your big ones. But you grew up in Sydney, like you alluded to. Whereabouts in Sydney did you grow up?
I grew up in Maroubra Beach in Sydney. Yep. My dad was from there originally. We did like a couple of years overseas, but the majority of my life was at Maroubra Beach in Sydney.
Yeah. And I understand, despite the fact that you're now riding these crazy 20 to 30 feet waves, initially you were scared of the water. Is that right, as a child?
Terrified. Well, not necessarily the water in it of itself, but I was terrified of the surf. And that's what a lot of people think when they see what I do for a living. It's like he's most likely born crazy, or born with like some sort of brain defect that stops him from feeling fear, or you don't feel fear as much as the average person. But it couldn't be further from the truth. Like compared to all the other kids when I was out in the water when I was really young, I was the most scared one. And so scared that my mum used to have to paddle out and rescue me over and over again when I was a little kid, which gets a little bit embarrassing. I mean, especially when you grow up in a place like Maroubra Beach, that's like renowned for this rough, tough neighborhood, and you're sitting out in the surf, surrounded by all your friends and the older surfers that you look up to, and then your mum paddles out in a boogie board to rescue in front of everyone. It's a pretty embarrassing experience.
In a pink weddy, maybe.
Exactly.
So I guess what happened though? Like you grew up fearful of the water, fearful of the surf, your mum rescuing you in the surf. But at what point did that kind of switch in your brain flick over and you started to just really embrace the surf and the surf lifestyle?
Well, I was absolutely in love with surfing, even though I was scared when the waves got bigger. Surfing in general, I loved it more than anything else in my life. Yeah. And to me, it was the ultimate. To be able to make a career out of that and earn my living doing what I love so much would just be the absolute ultimate. I realized by probably 18, 20 years old that I wasn't good enough to make a career on the world surf tour, like being a competitive surfer vying for a world championship. And at that point, the kind of only other avenue was to go down the world of big wave surfing. Mm-hmm. And at that point in time, like around 2000, 2001, that was kind of in some ways a lucrative option. There weren't many people doing it. And if you could do it and generate a lot of exposure, the magazines and then the sponsors and everyone loved that. And I think my love for surfing and my desire to create a career out of the sport overrode the fear that I had in the ocean. Yeah. And just bit by bit, slowly, I just pushed myself to surf a little bit bigger waves and bigger waves again and bigger waves again and bigger waves again. And I did all the training and the preparation in between to the point where I got to a point in my career where I felt like I've surfed the biggest waves in the world, and I could manage it. But that's where the danger of kind of overconfidence comes in, and then that leads to all kinds of problems as well.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in our conversation, I'm sure. But I like the fact that you figured that you weren't going to make it on the World Surfing Tour, but then you looked for these other avenues. And I think like whatever you're pursuing in life, there's always other ways to get into the game, whether it is going into the big wave surfing, but even then maybe making a career out of the back office stuff, going to work for the likes of Rip Curl and Billabong, being a cameraman out on the tour. Like you can still be in and amongst the surf lifestyle without being Kelly Slater or one of the big boys on the tour, whatever you're looking to do, which is awesome. But that was going to be one of my questions. Like, were you just wired to chase these big waves? But it sounds like you just wanted to make a living doing it, and that was the next logical avenue that you could explore.
Yeah, and then I think slowly over time, maybe I became wired to surf big waves, because it's like you become so addicted to the feeling of feeling crazy amounts of fear and then getting through it. And then on the other side is just like this adrenaline rush and amazing dump of emotions that it just feels so good that over time, when you experience that a bunch of times, your body becomes addicted to it, your brain becomes addicted to it. And I think that's what happened eventually. It's like, and there were periods where I felt like it was too much and I'd pull back from surfing big waves. Mm-hmm. But then after, a couple of months, I'd just be driven to go and do it again and do something exciting again. And I think for me, that's probably what has led me down the road of public speaking, which for me is a way bigger fear than surfing big waves, being really introverted.
Yeah.
But I think like there's still the excitement in public speaking for me that gives me that rush. So as much as I like at times despise doing it and the nerves of it are so hard, there's something in me that now that on the other side of doing that talk, I know how good that feeling is. So it's just like I'm now addicted to that.
It's funny. A lot of people who are into, say, quote unquote extreme sports, whether it's surfing or I think it was Colin O'Brady who walked across Antarctica. He wrote a book about his expedition, and he said that writing the book was way harder than walking across Antarctica solo, unassisted. Right. So a bit like yourself saying public speaking is scarier than riding these 30-foot waves.
I've been trying to write a book for like 6 years. It's way more terrifying. Put it like that's my thing. I could put content out about surfing and just surfing big waves, but any other content is terrifying, man. Yeah. Judgment from the external peers and the world around you, that's a terrifying thing.
Well, you got to go through the fear, like you say, mate. It's interesting because, I call myself a kook, right? So anything above 5 feet and I shit myself. So, but having said that, if I catch like a 4-footer and I ride it for 10 seconds, it's the same kind of thing. Like I might struggle for half an hour, but I catch that wave relatively small. But again, I've got that dopamine high afterwards. I'm buzzing. And even if it took me half an hour to catch one good wave, I'm like, oh, fuck, that was great. Let's go back out for another half an hour and try and catch another one and, battle it out with other people in the lineup and all that sort of stuff. And like, I think unless you're a surfer, you might not appreciate that, but it is something about that high that it does wire you over time to want to seek more and more and more. And I don't think I'll ever be looking for 20-foot waves, but maybe over time, maybe up to 10, right? So it's just, I think once you catch that bug, it's hard to just walk away from it, because it's not just the dopamine though, but it's also therapy. It's so many different things. I mean, what does surfing represent for you outside of that dopamine high and outside of chasing, greatness or just the biggest possible wave you can catch?
I think you just touched on something there that's so important, where you said, like the feeling you get from that 4-foot wave, I guarantee you that's the same feeling that I get from a 30-foot wave. Because it's just in relation to your experience level, your skill set, and where you're at on that journey. And I often talk to people about this. It's like, because that feeling that you felt because you pushed yourself to get there, like that's the experience of greatness. Like when people say they achieve greatness, well, what does achieving greatness actually feel like? I think that's what it is. And it's like, it's just in direct proportion to how hard you have pushed yourself and what you went through to get there. So it's like when you see like a Michael Jordan or a freak athlete experiencing this, like they're the better than everyone else in the world, like what it actually feels like. I don't think the feeling is much different to what any given individual can feel, as long as they push themselves as hard as what, say, Michael Jordan's pushing himself. I think it's just so directly proportional to how hard you push yourself. So those feelings that you idolize, like the greatness and stuff, they're so attainable, like if you just push yourself there. And I think that's in surfing, everyone can experience that. And there's so many other things about surfing that just, when I sort of analyze it, map out so perfectly for the fundamental principles of human psychology and what makes us happy. It's like, the constant chase is always there. So you're always trying to progress to a goal, but because the environment's always changing, it's like you never perfect the sport of surfing, but you always have that constant movement and chase and progression, which is kind of the fundamental principles of humans being happy, So I think and then you're outside, you're immersed in the environment. It's scary enough that it forces you into the present moment when you're standing on a wave. So in that way, it's meditation. There's a social aspect because you go and do it with your friends. And even if you're going out there alone and there's other surfers out there, you're still experiencing that thing together, So there's like that relationship aspect there. It's just, every time I pull it apart, and one day maybe I'll write a psychology thesis on the sport of surfing, but I just feel like it's probably the best hobby you can pick up as a human being.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, mate. And I think what you touched on there about everything, that feeling being relative to where your capabilities are at. I mean, there is research on that in terms of the psychology of flow, where you get into the flow state when it's about roughly 4% beyond your current capabilities. And that flow state feels the same for everyone. That's when you are super present, the rest of the world fades away, and you're just riding this insane dopamine high afterwards. So you could be riding a 2-foot wave for the first time and experiencing flow, or you could be catching a 30-foot monster.
I find that the research in and around that flow state, and everyone, that's the sort of a pinnacle of human experience. And then I guess if you were going to go switch to the experience of being the greatest at something in comparison to everyone else, I think that reference of what I'm doing compared to other people, it might give you a short hit of feeling good, but it doesn't seem like it's sustainable, because eventually you're not the greatest anymore. And it seems like a lot of top level athletes sort of struggle on the back end of that wave. It's not a sustainable thing to chase, to be the best compared to other people, because eventually you're not, and then you're going to have to deal with those consequences down the track. It's better to sort of, if you chase your own personal progression, and keep progressing towards different goals, that seems way more sustainable than just trying to be the best,
So rather than comparing yourself to others, comparing yourself to who you were yesterday and just trying to get that little bit better.
Exactly. And like you said, that was so interesting, that 4% above your capability, that's finding that sweet spot in the different things that you do in life is so interesting.
Definitely. And it's funny what you say as well about chasing, the championships and everything else and comparing yourself to others. And when you're on the way up, it's one thing, but even when you are on the way up and you score some goals, those goalposts are forever shifting, right? I think it's called the Arrival Fallacy, where you're never really happy. You think, once I win this championship, then I'll be happy. Once I have the girl, then I'll be happy. Once I have this much money in my bank account, then I'll be happy. But oftentimes it's not enough for people, right?
100%. The next day, you have to find a new goal to move towards. It's the consumatory reward system in your brain. It's chase food, get food, eat food, and then you got to move on to the next thing. It's like shopping. You're so excited about the new product you're going to buy, go out, go shopping, but then you get it, and then people have that off the back of going shopping, that sort of drop off of positive emotion. And it's because it's not like you're saying, that fallacy of, you think it's the moment of successfully finishing the goal that is the be all and end all, but it's not. It's the progression towards the goal that's the
100%. I think we've all
sweet
got,
spot to sit into.
yeah. I think we've all got these evolutionary biases that fool us into thinking that our decisions are going to make us happier, like shopping, for example. And you mentioned though the constant chase of looking for that perfect wave. And it's funny nowadays we have. I mean, I had Andrew Ross on the show from Urban Surf in Melbourne, and I know you've been out there a few times. And then there's Kelly Slater's Surf Ranch over in California. I imagine you've surfed over there as well.
I haven't surfed Kelly's one. I've injured in the period where there were spots open, so I couldn't go and surf it.
Fair enough.
I've surfed almost all the other types of wave pools.
Yeah. So I guess I forgot who it was that made the quote or who said this, but basically around Kelly Slater's surf pool, saying, "Who would have thought that perfection would be so mundane?" Obviously, it's a great way to kind of hone your skill set, but a big part of the surfing is the unknown, right? Like the thrill of the chase, not knowing what the surf's going to do, when it's going to do it, sitting out past the break and just waiting.
I think it's like almost the entire, without that, it's a different sport. And that's what you're finding in the wave pools. Like if you're overexposed to the wave pool and you get to surf it over and over again, then that thrill is missing, and all surfers eventually feel that,
Yeah.
But I mean, for different degrees of performance level, that could take a long time. I mean, you could surf Kelly Slater's wave pool for a long time, and there's so many different parts on your performance that you could perfect on that wave. But for a lot of like the top level professional surfers that go there, they get pretty bored within like, I don't know, a week of surfing it, just because they're such good surfers that they've kind of perfected the majority of ways to ride that wave. And then it is that thing of like, that's where you can paddle out into surf that's really average on the scale of what's good surf. And you're out there and it's just like an average surf, but then one wave will come through that's just like twice as good as anything else that's out there on that day. And that's what makes that wave seem so fun when you ride it, just because it's just like out of the blue, something different. And that's the beauty of surfing. It's just every single wave that breaks on the ocean shoreline is totally different. So it's,
I guess
it's going to master it.
Yeah, I guess it's like scarcity, right? Like we value things that are scarce. So when that one wave comes through that's twice as good as anything else that came through that day, it's like, wow, just mind blowing.
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly.
So for those of you watching on the YouTube, we've got an image here of Mark riding a big wave. What's that, about 30 odd feet?
Yeah, I'll tell you the face of it when you measure, if I'm standing there about 5 foot tall, it'd be around 30 feet.
Yeah,
the face.
That is insane. And we have something from, I think this was at Jaws in Maui in Hawaii.
This one's going to make me shiver in pain if it's the one I'm thinking of.
No, it's not, but we're going to cue that one up in a little while. I think this was a contender for Ride of the Year. So.
Oh yeah, no, this is a nice moment in surfing where you actually get to make a big, wave.
Awesome. So I guess, I mean, the first time you went out to chase big waves was over at Shipstone's Bluff over in Tassie, right? And I mean, that first time what was the progression? So you went from riding 8 to 10 footers max over at Maroubra to how big at Shipstone's?
Yeah, that was basically the progression. Like I was trying to surf big waves all around where I lived in Maroubra, and fairly big waves, like in the 10-foot range, and scary waves, and slowly building up. But the trip to Tasmania for that first time was such a massive leap for me in what was like how big that surf was, and I always just think about it, it's like I ended up in that moment in Tasmania in waves like twice as big and scary as anything I've ever surfed, and I never would have taken that step into those waves if I knew it was going to be that big and scary. But it was kind of like, for a whole host of reasons, how motivated I was on that day, it was like it proved to me in the blink of an eye that I could surf big waves. Because after that trip, like we went on to surf some of the biggest barreling waves in surf history at that point, and then it was like those photos and the footage spread out all over the media, mainstream media, all around the world. And then it was like everyone else in the surf industry considered me a big wave surfer, except for me. Like I was like, I never considered myself a big wave surfer at that point, but it was like everyone else believed it. Oh, that's that kid from Maroubra. He charges huge waves. And I was just like, okay, I guess if you say so. And it just and it grew from there. It was just one of those moments in my career in surfing that was a huge leap of progression, I think.
Yeah.
And you have a few of those different moments.
Yeah, it's funny though, because you're kind of dropped into the deep end, excuse the pun, whereby you were there, and if you had known how big it was, you wouldn't have gone out there, but you were there, you're like, screw it, let's do it. And the rest is history. I mean, the videos were released and distributed throughout the surfing community, and you became a big wave surf superstar more or less overnight. But
it was the perfect storm of motivation, that specific trip, because I was at the point where I wasn't earning enough money from surfing for it to be a career, and I was working in Circular Quay, like making coffees, cocktails at night, like just working bar jobs. And I was right at the point where I was like, I got to give this away and go and study. You know, I think I was 19 then, 18 or 19. I was like, I'm trying too hard here and it's not working. I've got to do something, you know, that's more reliable than this. And at the same time, I was living, sharing a unit with my mum, and she was pretty sick at that time. She'd been sick for about a month with a condition that we didn't know what it was, but she couldn't get out of bed to work. Found out later it was vertigo, which is the symptoms of are terrible. You can fix it quick if it's diagnosed. But like, she was really sick. And at that point I was like, I got invited on this trip to Tasmania by a surf magazine. And I was like, this is my only chance to kickstart this career. I've got my mum here. So like, if she doesn't get better, then, you know, I've got to look after her. So I got to get something happening, you know? So I was just so much more motivated on that given day to surf big waves, or on that trip, than I ever was in my life before that. And then it just pushed me over the edge to take off on those first few waves that were way bigger and scarier than anything I'd seen before. But then when I did it, and it's actually in surfing when I actually wiped out on one of those huge waves and realized that I was like, oh, this isn't actually too bad. You know, like in big wave surfing, like, unless something, it's a small percentage chance something really goes wrong, you know, you hit the reef. But other than that, the wipeouts aren't that bad. And that's what I learned in that moment, just of that heightened motivation pushed me over the edge. And then I learned I'm capable of doing this. And that was the big change. Yeah.
So a perfect storm of motivation. And I also like what you said there about it's actually not that bad. Like, you look at these huge waves and you just think about wiping out under the, the sheer weight of one of these waves. You think it's going to be the worst thing in the world, but that's a bit of an analogy for life in a way, where, you know, public speaking, oh man, I'm so anxious about doing this, but you get up there and, oh, it's actually not that bad.
It's so true.
Yeah, skydiving. I remember when I first went skydiving, I think the week leading up to it was 100 times worse than the actual experience itself. Once I jumped out of the plane, that was the easy bit. It was just all the mental chatter in the lead up to it that was terrifying.
That's so true. I often think that's like, it's like you're running in your brain ancient software that slowly needs to be updated or upgraded. It's like we've got this like fear response systems built in our brains that were built in really harsh environments that were so unbelievably dangerous that you had to like forward think and focus on all these different negatives that might happen, because if you didn't do that and you weren't ridiculously fearful of your environment, you'd die. And it's like you're still running that software now in your brain. So it's just like bit by bit you have to upgrade that software, and the only way to do that is exposure to the environments that you're scared of. Build the skill set, expose yourself to that environment, and just slowly like reprogram that software and update it, you know, and then you're not as scared when you go back into those environments.
It's a great point. And I think, you know, we're obviously wired from tens of thousands of years of running around the African savannah, trying to evade predators, where a positive outcome would be good, but more often than not, a negative outcome would mean death. So you would just do this, you take the safe road, the path of least effort. And I think, you know, we're all wired to do that nowadays.
100%.
Yeah, the more you expose yourself to that more difficult road, the easier it starts to feel over time. So you mentioned like there was this perfect cocktail of motivation. Obviously your mum wasn't well at the time. You wanted to make a living in surfing. You found yourself at Shipstone's Bluff. All these things kind of came together. Another thing that perhaps may have shaped you is, I mean, growing up, you hung out with, I suppose the notorious bra boys over at Maroubra, at least that's how they're remembered now, who gained international media attention in 2007 with the documentary chronicling all the stuff that went on around there. And I think I've got an image of the film here. So that was around 2007. I'd love to just unpack how growing up around that sort of scene of partying, fighting, and surfing kind of shaped you as well. And did that prepare you mentally for big wave surfing?
Yeah, I think I'd have to like set context around like the media painted what the Bra Boys was into one thing, like just and not saying that they were completely wrong, but it was like they just took the certain elements that were interesting to people, and it was like all the bad stuff that went on around the suburb. I mean, you get 200 teenage individuals doing whatever they're doing, there's a lot of bad stuff going on, and they just heightened that. So it's like I was kind of in and out of both those worlds. Like the world of Bra Boys that I grew up with was around like mostly my close friends who went on to become really good athletes or really successful in their own right in different fields. And then the main one being Kobe Abaddon, who was a professional surfer back then. Mm-hmm. And at that point in time, he was pretty much one of the best big wave surfers on the planet. And he was, at that point in his life, one of the most driven individuals I've come across. So it's like, and he kind of took me under his wing, where I was traveling with him a whole bunch to waves around the world. And he kind of passed on to me things that didn't get passed on to him, as far as like how valuable it is to be strict and driven for training, to avoid drugs. Like he grew up in a family that was just ravished by drugs. So he never let me even try like cocaine or anything like that. And to this day, I still haven't tried it, just because of that influence when I was young, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like there were elements within growing up in the Bra Boys that were like negative influences, but then there were crazy positive ones as well, and it was just like this amalgamation. And but there were definitely moments where, for me, it was like, as I started to surf big waves and get addicted to that adrenaline, and a big part of that is like when you're young, you want to prove yourself to your peers, you know, like that's that part of stepping out of your family environment, and then you want to prove yourself to the broader community, you know, like that psychological leap that you have. Like as a teenager, you move from your family, move into the broader community, and you're surrounded by peers, and the huge motivator of young adults is impressing people, like massive. You can't avoid that. And so for me, I was doing that big wave surfing, but then there was like this undercurrent of like where you could prove it, you know, within fighting, you know, like, and it was like, unfortunately at that point, like the UFC hadn't been built there where you could just go and prove it that way. And like, we were just, you know, like getting into a lot of trouble on the streets, like fighting on the streets. And I kind of got caught up in that a little bit, but luckily I had enough good motivating people in my life that I didn't, you know, and I had a few lucky escapes where I didn't end up in jail. So, and they kind of highlighted how dangerous, you know, continuing making these dumb decisions were, you know.
Yeah. No, that and I think, you know, you're absolutely right. Media will always look for the negative news bites, because that's essentially what gets eyeballs. That's what gets engagement. We don't hear the media report on planes landing successfully at, you know, New York JFK Airport or something like that. We hear about plane crashes, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Totally get that.
But not to say that there's not, like, there's every character under the sun in any given Sydney suburb, and like when you're pulling in, like, where, like, it's attractive for young adult men to be part of a tribe like what the Bra Boys was, and the influence of that tribe can be unbelievably beneficial if things are progressing in one way, but then they can be crazy detrimental because it's such a powerful time of young adults' lives where you're so heavily influenced by the group, you know, that if the group's going in the wrong direction, it's like, and a lot of people that I grew up around, like, ended up making mistakes that then you got to carry the consequences for the rest of your life, whether it's a criminal record, like that's not a hard thing to shake and get back on your feet and sort your life out when you've got a criminal record. Like, it's even just a criminal record and then doing something stupid enough to lose your license for a long period can set you back like a decade in life, you know. Like, so there's all these positives and all these negatives, and it needs to be ironed out as best it can. But it was never the part that the media portrayed the worst was that they always portrayed it as like this organized criminal gang, you know. Like, we had this rule structure and we had a criminal network that was earning money and everyone benefited.
Like the Corleone family, mate.
Yeah, like that's the way they portray it. Or a bikie gang, like they portrayed it as that, and it was so far from that. Like, it was just a whole bunch of young youth that loved the beach, loved surfing, and like the majority were coming out of like terrible family structures, you know. So they were already bringing that sort of anger from a previous family structure into the group, and it was just that result is always going to be lots of positives, lots of negatives.
And I think that's something people often overlook, the fact that people are the way they are due to many variables that are outside of their control. Upbringing, you mentioned Kobe Aberden, growing up in a house that was, you know, just flush with drugs and all sorts of difficulty. I mean, that's something that people oftentimes just forget about and just focus on who that person is now, or focus on one aspect of their character. Like you said, he made you disciplined, he kept you away from drugs, and there were all these other positive aspects. But something you also mentioned, which I found was interesting, was the fact that you kind of end up associating yourself with a particular tribe or group, and that group could go in a positive direction or a negative direction, and that could shape you for 5, 10 plus years. It's interesting because we have, like, when we're about 13 to 15, this sort of coming of age ceremony. And again, it goes back to this evolution that we've been talking about. Like, the last thing you want is to be ostracized from your tribe, from your group, right? So you kind of go along with the fights, with all the partying and everything else, because that's where you derive so much of your identity from, right? So it's kind of like, how do you want to balance keeping everyone happy in terms of, you know, going with the tribe, but also making sure you're not putting yourself on the wrong road, you know, long term. So yeah, just thought I'd double click on that one.
No, it's so true. And then it's like, I think like there naturally has to be this progression that a lot of kids who grow up in that sort of gang environment or that tribal environment is that they continue the thought process that group or that tribe is the most important thing. Like, that comes first and everything else second, but which is the wrong mentality. It might be important to you at that age, but it has to switch in your brain that eventually your family is first. Like, it's like your wife, the mother of your children, they're first, everything else distant second, you know, like, and there's this switch that you see at play where like people struggle to then walk away from like those elements within the tribe to put their families first, and that creates like crazy disruption in people's lives, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely does. So we might as well take this opportunity to digress away from the Bra Boys and get back into surfing. I mean, I can't have a big wave surfer on the show and not ask, you know, what's the biggest wave you've surfed? Because that's, I think, a default question with any big wave surf interview. So what's the biggest wave, mate?
It'd have to be in around 50-foot range, I'd say, and be Jaws off Maui in Hawaii. The original name is Piahi, but it's probably the pinnacle big wave surfing spot on the planet. Yeah. And the biggest wave I've ridden was towed in by a jet ski. But then at Jaws is also the biggest waves that I've paddled into, which are more in the like 30, maybe 40-foot range.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, when you're paddling, say, towards shore and you've got this body of water forming behind you that you're going to try and paddle onto and catch, I mean, what goes through your mind? Obviously, now you've kind of desensitized yourself to that somewhat. But when you were first catching these huge waves, I mean, you're looking back and you're like, what's the thought process in that time? I guess you probably don't have time to think. You just have to kind of catch it. Otherwise, you're going to have a really adverse outcome if you just kind of sit there and freak out.
Oh no, there's a lot of thinking before you take the drop down the wave. Like from the time you're taking the drop, like you jump to your feet, going down the wave, then there's no time to think. But beforehand, there's so many thoughts popping in and out of your head. I always like the thing with paddling into big waves is the positioning where you need to be able to catch a huge wave. And the hardest thing is you need to be on this fine line between where that wave could break on top of you, or you could be in the perfect spot. And the part of controlling your fear is that when you see that big wave coming towards you, you naturally like that overreactive fear response in your brain goes, this wave's going to break on top of you. And then you paddle as fast as you can out to avoid that happening, but then you can't catch the wave. So being able to catch a huge wave is, and I always liken this to when I watch Braveheart, the movie, Mel Gibson, and he's holding like that line of his army, and then they're getting charged by, the British army are charging in him, and he's yelling out to all his soldiers to hold your position, hold your position, hold your position, even though that terrifying thing's coming towards you. And in my head, that's always what clicks into mind when I'm sitting there. I can see this monster wave that I have to stay in this position to catch. I'm just telling myself, just hold, and like stay in the right spot. And then from the moment that you drop into the wave, it's like you just forced into the present moment. Like there's not much thinking going on there. There's like slight moments of thought around positioning and stuff, but any time that you think too far ahead of what's going on exactly in front of you, that's where the wipeouts happen. And I mean, the conditioning yourself to be able to, I look at it as you condition yourself to be able to utilize your maximum skill level in that scary moment. And I think that's just always prepare for the worst. So if I prepare, all my preparation is how to deal with the wipeout that may happen. And when I prepare for that, it takes a little bit of that fear out of the process. And then I can access that potential in the moment, So it's just prepare. And it's the same for me in public speaking. It's like, here's the list of things that can go wrong in public speaking. And it's like, have an escape route for every single one so that you don't have to worry too much about them. So it's like public speaking for me, I always because I get so anxious on stage that sometimes my mind just blanks out, and I don't know the next thing that I'm supposed to be talking about. And I know that can happen. So now I've just I can just write a note and put it on the ground in front of me that the audience can't see. And it's just a note to remind me of a story that I can tell, or a line that I can say, or a question I can ask the audience, that if I go blank, I can just do that. And it fits almost anywhere in my keynote. And then when I do that, I can get back on track, after it. And usually when I have that note there, and my mind never goes blank because I'm not so worried about it happening. And that's the similar thing in surfing, it's just preparing for the worst.
Of course,
underwater training.
I love that. And I think some people like to use memory palaces. So they'll have a visual image of walking through a house as they're giving this keynote talk. And there might be cues, like there's a photo on the wall to your left when you walk in the house with an image of something on it, which is supposed to cue something.
It works awesome.
Yeah, that works quite well. But I love what you said there also about preparing for the worst possible outcome. I know a lot of high-performance athletes do this. John Jones, the UFC champion, says he's visualized losing. He's okay with it. He's visualized dealing with the media afterwards, letting down his family, the other fighter, just shoving it in his face, all that sort of stuff, and he's okay with that. So once he's visualized,
I get goosebumps when you mention that, because I think it hits home when you explain that, when people hear that, because the fear of losing is usually going to be the thing that stops you from being able to perform at your best. So if you're okay with it, then all of a sudden then you have the best shot of winning.
Yeah, exactly. You can just focus on winning and not be fearful of losing the whole time, and let that consume your energy and the way you show up. But I mean, you're talking about finding that perfect spot when you're paddling out into a wave, so you avoid the wave breaking on top of you. So speaking of waves breaking on top of us, I've got one of you here in 2000 and I think it's 2013, Wipeout of the Year contender.
Oh, man.
I don't know if you remember 2010. So this was way back.
I know this one.
So if you're listening, check out the YouTube clip with Mark.
Yeah, this is Shipstone's Bluff, so it's like a 30-foot wave, whoever's not watching the footage. And it's a mutant-looking wave. One that I know that this was my return to Shipstone's Bluff after I'd had a bad wipeout there and an injury a year before this.
Yep.
And I hadn't been back down to surf it, and I was so nervous about going back down to surf it. And I remember in the lead up to that swell, I probably had 1,000 different nightmares go on in my head about all the things that are going to go wrong in this swell that I'm going to go surf. And I swear not one of those nightmares did I even picture a wave that big and scary looking. It's like I didn't even know that existed. Yeah. The craziest thing was that wipeout almost did nothing to me. Like I was violent underwater, didn't hit the bottom, like came up without a scratch on me. And as far as getting my confidence back after the time I had a bad wipeout at Shipstones and hit the bottom, that to me was the quickest way. It was like wipe out, and that gave me the confidence to then go on and ride big waves that day.
Yeah, and it's funny seeing these huge wipeouts. Well, it's not funny, but it's interesting seeing these huge wipeouts where you kind of get sucked up the face of the wave, kind of like a washing machine. I mean, what's the feeling when you're getting pulled up through this sort of thing and just getting thrown around?
Oh, there's this moment of sheer terror. Like it's like because you have just enough time to think. So you fall on that huge wave, and then as soon as you fall, you just like you have this sheer terror of, oh my God, because you know you're about to go through that wipeout, and then the wave on all its power like slowly picks you up, and then you have a floating sensation because you basically are like it's like you're up in the air but you're underwater at the same time because you're inside the lip of the wave that's going to then crash down 20 feet into the waterbed, you know. And so you have that moment of sheer terror and then weightlessness right before the explosion and the violence. And I always feel like because I've trained this into me from doing all the underwater training that we do, that it's like the moment of terror hits, but then my brain switches to relax because I know that that's the only way to survive the wipeout, you know. And if I sit in that panic and let it play out and override me, then I'm going to have less chance of dealing with that wipeout, and my body will go tense, and then the injuries happen and all those different types of things. So I think it's like been trained into me enough to that I feel the panic, but then it's like the next response I have is relax because of the training that I've done. Yeah,
it's kind of like, in a way, getting pulled into a rip. You feel the panic, but you know that the best response is to just breathe, paddle horizontally and just find a spot where you can get back into shore. Because if you just freak out and, breathe really heavily, you're just going to lose your energy. You're not going to be able to paddle out anymore. And that's
energy will vanish. And that's in your oxygen when you're doing underwater breath trainings. As soon as you panic, your oxygen vanishes because your heart rate goes fast, and then the oxygen spreads out all through your body, and then it shortens your ability to hold your breath. I don't know. I think like in a panicked response, you could only hold your breath to about 10% of what you're actually capable of. So being able to control that fear response underwater can give you like a 90% better sort of performance, you know. And I think that holds true, like maybe not the 10% to 90%, but if you went like that, fear most likely will keep performance in a varying degree of fields in whatever you're performing at. I think the fear would hold you to about 50% of your capacity, 60% maybe, and you most people have, in most areas of their life, have another 40% in there that's available if you can manage the fear and the stress response.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I guess on these wipeouts, I mean, you mentioned hitting the floor at Shipstone's Bluff. For people who aren't big wave surfers or just aren't into surfing, listening to this, perhaps, I mean, I imagine two of the worst things that can go wrong is just being held under too long, where you come up unconscious, or just hitting the surface and hitting all sorts of sharp sort of coral and reef and whatnot that just cuts your face open. I mean, I've got an image here of, I think it was Keala Kennelly.
Phenomenal big wave surfer.
Yeah, so let me just remove that image.
I'd say top 5 or 10 bravest
Yeah, like her
I've come
face was
across.
completely ripped open because she hit the floor. I think it might have been at Chopu in Tahiti. Looking great with the scar there. Looks okay now, but man, that's frightening stuff. So speaking of hitting the floor and crazy wipeouts, I mean, what have some of your most harrowing experiences been?
Oh man, similar thing, but hitting my leg. And just to preface that with Kiala, this is how brave this chick is. She did that, and then I think it was a year later, went on to win Barrel of the Year, and that's not just female Barrel of the Year, like across male and female Barrel of the Year at the same wave. Like, so after doing that to her face, then a year later went on to ride one of the craziest waves at Chope I've ever seen.
And that's
like she's phenomenal.
But I guess that's a trait that a lot of big wave surfers share, that you can experience these nuts wipeouts, you know, have half your face ripped off, but get back into it. Whereas a lot of people, perhaps when they suffer some kind of setback, you know, public speaking, and it just goes terribly bad, and they're like, oh, I'm never doing this again. I mean, I guess that's perhaps something you're predisposed to, just getting back up on the horse, or there's probably numerous reasons. It's probably motivation. It's like, no, I want to get
yeah. I think it's fundamentally motivation. Like it's the love for the sport, love for what you're doing, where you're trying to take your career, and that's what I always end up back on when I'm trying to like analyze my own performance in speaking or surfing. It's like I always end up back at motivation, and it's like your success is just how, like, it starts at how motivated you are, and how motivated you can stay over long periods of time is always seems like the most important thing. Yeah. And it's just like all the different ways you can create that motivation and sustain it, and still function through the dips of the downturns of low motivation. And like, I think that's the bed of performance. Like that's the fundamental. And then there's all these other little bits that add the other sort of 15, 20 percenters, 10 percenters, but that part's of the bed. You know?
So on that bedrock of performance, what do you do to kind of peak or to keep investing in your own motivation when perhaps things aren't going that well?
I think for me, like, clarity of goals, like what you're chasing, is probably the fundamental part. And if you can have like long-term meta goals, like pictures of what success looks like in the different areas of your life, like not just in one. I think that's a problem that you fall into, is where you're only hyper-focused in one area of life, like it might be business or your career, and then you're not as focused in the other areas of your life. And then when relationships, for example, fall apart, they're going to destroy your career anyway. So it's like, set those long-term meta goals in every aspect of your life, from business, personal life, relationships, and then your health, right? So what's life look like at 65 years old, you know, in those categories. So then deduce back from there, right back from year to year, month to month, like to the days and the micro actions you take that adhere to those long-term goals, you know? Like, what do you do each day that is creating progress towards those goals? And then I think that in itself creates a motivational feedback loop, because I listened to a neuroscientist, a Russian neuroscientist, explain this, and it's a part in your brain called the orienting reflex that's constantly figuring, and it's an ancient part of your brain, it's a fundamental part of your brain that it produces the majority of your positive emotion, like up to 80% of your ability to have positive emotion comes from the orienting reflex. And what it's doing is constantly scanning the environment to see where you are in relation to goals like that you need. And when it perceives progression towards a goal, then your brain floods with some positive emotion like serotonin, dopamine. So if you don't have clarity of goals, then you're making it nearly impossible for that part of your brain to produce 80% of the positive emotion, because you can't see progression. And then that's what is the basis of anxiety, because you're not clear on what you're doing and where you're going. So then you're uncertain about what's happening. And the uncertainty is what is creating the anxiety, because it's like that part of your brain's just going, fuck, what's happening? I don't know what to do. I'm not moving forward. I'm not doing this. And then you're not building positive emotion.
Yeah.
And then the negative side of when that happens is that your body needs the positive emotion. So then your brain will go to the easiest option to get it, which will be all the different vices in your life, like the drugs, alcohol, like just binge watching like Netflix or something. Like it's just trying to find it, and the only way to manage like that addiction to all those different things is to make sure you have that goal that gives that orienting reflex part of your brain the ability to notice progression. So it's like without that, you're pushing shit uphill. Like you can use all the other motivation things, but without that fundamental thing, I think you're going to constantly battle to stay motivated. And it's not to say that, like you spoke about earlier, it's not to say that all those things can't change, but as long as you're moving in the generally right direction, and then you'll spot different avenues or different potential things that you can achieve, and you'll switch and go down there, and then you keep progress though. But it's like progress is the thing that makes us happy, it seems. And that's what 100%. Makes you motivated.
Yeah. No, I think that there's a lot of research on one, goal setting, and two, short feedback loops being fundamental for motivation. And that's why I think so many people that work at, say, large corporations are completely demoralized and hate their jobs, because they spend so much time in meetings and it's hard for them to see the direct connection between the work they do and the result.
Exactly.
So you have no feedback loop. So you just end up, like you said, going shopping and binge watching Netflix and drinking a lot.
Which isn't bad in moderation.
In moderation, most things are. Yeah. So I find that interesting. And I had a guy on the show by the name of Scott Belsky, who built a company called Behance, sold it for several $100 million to Adobe. And one thing he said was, in the early days, we're a long way from Kansas, in terms of making that big money and everything else. But he would create these surrogate metrics. So instead of revenue, what are the other metrics that we can focus on in the short term, like people signing up to a mailing list, people having trials, how many sales calls are we making, all that sort of stuff that can show us that, hey, we are moving. And if we do more of this stuff, then the revenue and everything else will eventually follow.
So that'll be a result, like a byproduct of doing this. Yeah,
exactly.
And where you can find those details to highlight progression, I think that's such an important thing to create that feedback loop that builds that motivation.
Definitely.
And it makes you resilient in the same time, because the positive emotion is what cures anxiety. It's like, that's what the drugs that the doctors will give you if you go to say you're anxious, is they'll give you the ones that spur on some serotonin and dopamine. You'll feel less anxious. So it's like, you can get it there.
You get it. Yeah. Yeah, I find just going out for a surf, like if I'm feeling anxious, it kind of washes away some of that anxiety, and catch a few waves, dopamine, serotonin, that sort of neurochemical cocktail just releases, and I'm just a different person afterwards. So
different person,
yeah, 100%. Mate, we are almost out of the scheduled time, but can you go for about another 10 or 15 minutes or?
Yeah, man, I got heaps of time.
You got time? Beautiful.
One beautiful silver lining of the pandemic is got heaps of time.
Fantastic, because we got heaps of other stuff to talk about. So we've kind of, I did touch on, wipeouts and some of your worst experiences. I know you mentioned in an interview once that your scariest wave was over at Cyclops, near death apparently. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, Cyclops is a wave. I don't even like to call it a wave. It's not like to me, it's not a surfable wave.
Right.
And it was like in my heyday of young, like early 20s, of just taking risk to a crazy level. And a lot of that motivation was just to prove yourself to everyone around you, And I surfed a wave there that the wave is so shallow that it's almost that it's a breaking on a bare rock bed, and there's only an inch of water over it. And it's like, you're on such a knife's edge. If you do anything wrong, that sort of 15-foot wave is going to smash you into the rock bed. And I just had a moment where I chose a wrong line going into that wave, and it positioned me poorly. And it would have been I don't know. To me, it was like I basically had my eyes shut, and it was a fluke that I even made the wave. I just thought in that moment that I'll die if I fall here, and maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I'll just have an injury. But to me, it was so crystal clear that if I didn't make that wave, I was going to die. And I've never been back to surf it. Like, to me, it's not a surfable wave.
Yeah. Well, that's something that a lot of non-surfers probably don't get, is the fact that oftentimes you could be catching a wave where it's maybe 10, 20 feet deep, but where it breaks, it could be a foot deep. It goes from deep to shallow very, very, very quickly.
That's the most dangerous part of what I do as big wave surf, is when you surf really shallow waves, because I can control and prepare for how to hold my breath for a long time. So a big wave at Jaws off Maui can hold me down for a long time, and I can prepare for that. When you surf a shallow wave, you can prepare how to ride that wave, but if you do make a mistake, there's moments of where you're out of control, and it's just up to whether the wave smashes you into the reef or not. And that's how I ended up with the permanent disability that I've got now, is getting a probably 10-foot wave 5 hours down the south coast from Sydney. A 10-foot wave smashed me into the reef and dislocated my knee. So complete dislocation, tore all the ligaments, all the tendons, everything that holds your knee joint together tore. My knee separated. I got rolled around underwater by this wave, and while I was getting rolled around, it tore through the artery in my leg and the major nerves that control my foot. And luckily I was medevaced to the Canberra hospital, where they did emergency surgery and fixed the artery. And the surgeon told me the next day, he said, if you got here an hour later, we would have had to amputate your leg at the knee. So I was over the moon when I got that news. I was like, man, dodged a bullet there. But then in the next sentence, he's like, the bad news is that the nerve damage in your leg is so bad that we can't do anything to fix it. So it's like, you're not going to be able to use your foot anymore. Like, my foot's just dead, drops down. And that was shattering for me. It was like, he was basically telling me surfing's done for me. And if surfing's not done, professional surfing is done, And at that point in time, it was 2016. I was at the height of my professional surfing career, where I had the biggest sponsorships I had ever had. I was a Red Bull athlete. Everything was going. I was finally to the point where I can actually start setting myself up for the future. And then blink of an eye, gone, everything gone. And that was so tough to deal with. The combination of just not being able to surf, being stuck in a hospital bed, not being able to move, and then severe nerve pain. I've dealt with all the other types of pain, broken bones, everything like that. I've never had a problem with it, but this nerve pain was nothing I've experienced before. And so that perfect cocktail just led me to sort of spiral down into this, I'm not going to say it's there's so many variations of depression, right? But it was situational depression that I was in, that was a radical change in my life, chronic pain, not being able to move, so physiology changing, and I slipped into that sort of depressive state, and I couldn't get out of it until I had this chance meeting with a young kid who had read what had happened to me on a surf media website, and he wrote to me on Instagram. He's like, "Oh, I realized from the story that you're in Canberra Hospital. Do you think I can come up and meet you and get a photo with you?" He said, "I'm actually in the hospital too. I'm downstairs." And at that time, I hadn't even seen my close family and friends. I was just nah, didn't want to know about it. But my wife saw the message. She wrote back to him. She was like, "Yeah, no worries." His name's Jason. "No worries, Jason. Why don't you come up? We'll get a photo and we'll hang out for the afternoon. It'll be awesome." And I had no idea. And anyway, a few hours later, this young kid gets wheeled into my bedroom by his brother. He's a complete quadriplegic. He had an accident snowboarding, not doing anything crazy, on the first trip of an around the world holiday. He's 18 years old. And complete quadriplegic now, rest of his life. And he gets wheeled up to my bedroom and just sticks out his arm out as best as he can, trying to control it, to shake my hand. He shakes my hand, his big smile on his face. And I was like, man, in that moment, my mental state around what I was dealing with just switched, like complete 180. I just went from feeling like frustrated, angry, depressed about the situation I was in, like blaming everyone else, to just in that moment being completely overcome with gratitude, like feeling like the luckiest person on earth. Because if I hit the reef any other way than other than landing on my feet, I could be in the situation Jason's in, or worse, I could be dead. And it just highlighted it for me so strongly that, like, from that point, everything changed. The whole path of my recovery changed because of that. And just to like emphasize it for me, is like, he was this young kid dealing with a situation, an injury that was a million times worse than anything I was dealing with, and he was doing it so well, like just taking it on day by day. And that just, like, it made me think, like, it was like I couldn't, as soon as I felt down and out about what I was dealing with, it was like a slap in the face to someone like him who's dealing with life that's a million times worse. It's and I just was a constant reminder to me to like suck it up. It's not that bad. Like, someone like Jason would beg to be in my position, and like that little moment and the moments of gratitude and appreciation from there just helped my recovery more than anything else. And I got back to surfing 18 months later. It took. And
18 months.
Yeah. And like, I was able to get my first like barreling wave then, and I still didn't think I'd be surfing big waves again. I could surf it by that time. 18 months after the injury, I was surfing at like 50% of what I could surf before, like performance wise. Not enough to surf big waves. And but that was enough for me, because I didn't think I was going to be able to surf again. And it was like just such a highlight.
Where are you at now in terms of that recovery, in terms of 100%?
Well, from there, so it's been almost another 18 months since then. It's just slowly, like, it's not that I still have the disability, I can't move my foot, but I just slowly been able to get better at surfing with the disability, and I'm getting better and better and better and better and better. And I got to the point where it would have been 6 months ago, I went back down to Tasmania and surfed a big swell at Shipstone's Bluff. And got some huge barrels again, and off the back of doing that, I kind of proved to myself that maybe I can get back to surfing big waves. Like, I'm at this sort of level that's not as good as I was before, performance wise, but I think it's good enough to surf big waves, as long as I manage the risk a little better. Like, the way I'm going to surf these big waves has to be different than what I did before. And it was also enough I could send the footage into Red Bull, and they were over the moon and re-signed me for another couple of years.
Awesome. As
a Red Bull athlete. So I was like, I got my career kind of back on track, a little bit different now. I do a lot of public speaking on the side. It's not my full-time career surfing big waves, but man, just the ride of being able to go from thinking I wasn't going to surf again to surf big waves, and just like the most beneficial part of the recovery, or what benefited me the most, was the ability to access that emotion of gratitude at will. Like, as I went, like, I could just always do that by just reminding myself how bad it could be, and then that would just make me feel it. And I mean, you would know that there's so much science around the value of the emotional state of gratitude, and how beneficial it is health-wise for your nervous system and your ability to heal, ability to manage stress, all those different things. So I just got really, I became obsessed with being able to, how to access it, and like all the varying ways and techniques that you can use to build that emotional state. And there's some like these simple ones, like writing things down, like a list every morning of what you're grateful for. And then other ones that you wouldn't think is like, just like, if all your listeners now sat down and wrote a text to a family member or a friend saying that, look, I'm really grateful for your help, or I'm grateful you did this for me, or do that, and you pass gratitude to someone, you actually experience the emotional state of gratitude when you do it. So it's like a reverse engineered way of feeling good, and it benefits your relationships on top of that. But yeah, there's just so many varying ways of doing it, and that
definitely
became an obsession for me.
I think for people also just volunteering, say at a shelter, for example, one, it shows you that your life is actually quite good compared to some people's, and also it's taking the spotlight off you and your problems and putting it onto others. And the studies show that their anxiety tends to just slip away after those experiences, and they just feel a lot more positive about their own lives. So there are so many different ways to cultivate
on a multitude of levels why that works, like volunteering. And you see the studies where it's like all the people who live for a long time, like in their 80s and 90s, the majority are caregivers in some way. Like they've adopted a role at that late stage in their life where they're responsible for people and they're giving care to people, and that actually keeps them alive longer because it's so healthy to actually do that.
Yeah. Otherwise, people who tend to say retire at the age of 65 and then just not do anything, I think there's also studies that show sharp correlation between that retirement and early death if you don't actually go off and continue to contribute something to the world in some positive way.
So true.
Yeah. So I guess, during that period of rehabilitation, emotional rehabilitation, physical rehabilitation, obviously the gratitude piece played a massive role, but were there any sort of other revelations that came out of that, or learnings about yourself or the way you go about living your life that came from that experience?
Yeah, definitely. The other one that was fundamental to helping me get through it was just restructuring my goal framework of life. Like I couldn't surf anymore, or rather than all those goals were in place of professional surfing and me just thinking about them and what I'm missing out on, it's like put all that aside and get it out of my head. It's done. Don't even think about it. It's like where can I find progression in my life, even though I'm laying in a hospital bed for the next 9 months, and just like adapting a new goal framework that I could live within, and just putting the stuff that I couldn't do aside so it's not at the forefront of my mind all the time, and I think doing that helps so much, and it's similar to like the radical change. It's like a wipeout that the pandemic has put on everyone and some people's careers and everything like that. Like you're in the speaking industry, like for me, my like 95% of my income's vanished, like of speaking, and the progression that I was seeing of what I was planning to do was like, I was going to buy this house, like, like I'd set up a life plan and it's gone. So rather than like sit in it and dwell of what could have been, it's like restructure. Where can I find progression? Where can I like find different things that can keep me, it doesn't matter like as long as there is progression in what you're doing, you can stay happy, and I think that's the lesson I learned from the injury. And that's why for me, it was a little easier probably to adapt to the wipeout in my business career, because I just applied the same stuff,
Yeah. And it's a very stoic sort of outlook. Going back 2,000 years to ancient Rome, the Stoic philosophers, one of their the key ideas was that you focus on what you can control, not what you can't control. Too many people focus on what they can't control, and that's just a fast track to anxiety and depression, because you can't do anything about it. Focus on what you can control, and that empowers you to take action. And as you're taking action, you're just focused on taking action and getting closer to your goals. You're not focused on all this other stuff that's just not working out to your liking.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and when you always hear like really successful people talk about winning the morning, I think that's so valuable in that way, that winning in the morning just means that you did a few things in the morning that were important to get you towards whatever goals you got set. And then that rolls that feedback loop on. So it's like, how can you win the morning? And I would do that even when I was laid up in bed. If I just did a few things that made me feel good about my situation early in the morning, I do my like tiny little exercise routine of what I could do in that injury state. I'd like learn just one little thing, like listen to one podcast or practice one thing in public speaking. And then at least for the rest of the day, I knew I did that. And I just have made each of those like long days of lying around doing next to nothing and being in pain, just that little bit more manageable.
Yeah. And I find writing down, you mentioned gratitude journals. One thing I like to add to my journal is just what did I actually achieve today? What, because,
yes,
you know, and just reminding yourself, man, I got in a workout, I did 10,000 steps, I gave a keynote talk, I interviewed Mark on the podcast. And then it's like, oh, you feel good about yourself when you actually reflect on all the stuff you got done at the end of the day.
it's so true. And I think, like in your case, and a lot of high performers like yourself, probably like your mind's not geared to see those things and pat yourself on the back. Your mind's probably overly geared to just constantly look at what do you need to do next? What didn't you do? What do I have to do? You know, like, so doing that is such a good way to manage that sort of, like, it's an element of stress and anxiety that's making you successful and motivating you, but then you're managing it by just stopping at moments in the day to highlight, you know, give yourself a pat on the back for doing this. And I heard Jerry Seinfeld make a funny joke about it one time, and he was just like, how ridiculous humans are, where like the best part of your day is like crossing on a calendar around like a goal that, like, some stupid little goal that you're trying to do, but the moment it's when you're crossing on the calendar that highlights your progression is like the best moment ever. And he's like, he made this real funny joke of it, but it always stuck in my head how important it is.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I mean, speaking of stopping to smell the roses, you got married a couple of years ago, long-time girlfriend Brittany. I guess I'd love to know what it was like in terms of the impact or the strain, or did being a big wave surfer cause strain on your relationship while you were together? Because I imagine for her, it wouldn't have been easy watching you go out into these 20, 30, 40-foot waves.
I'll tell you what, there's going to be a whole lot of strain if I go back out and surf big waves consistently. I mean, the only person that an injury like that is tougher on than the person who gets injured is the person next to them looking after it. And it's way tougher on them, like, because it's like they're almost helpless, you know, in the whole situation. They just have to constantly feel the pain that you're feeling when they watch a loved one in, you know. And now that I had a baby a year ago, it's like that highlighted it for me, because it's like anytime my baby's like something's going on and she's crying or she's in pain or she trips over, it's so painful to watch that. And then I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I put Britt through that for such a long period of time. You know, it's it can be. And then for me to go back to surfing big waves the way that I did before would be selfish. Like, there's no way I'm ever going to take the amount of risk that I did in my early 20s, even right up to sort of my 30s. I'll just never do that. And it's not easy. I have to like really control myself in the moments. Like when I went back down to surf Tasmania for the first time, it's like I had trained myself over such a long period of time that when I was in that moment on that day, I was going to capitalize and push myself and take crazy risk. And it's like that's embedded into me. It's like, and then when I back down in Tasmania and I'm in that environment again, that's the way I'm programmed to react. So I have to like actually set like limitations to stop myself from doing that. And I even had like a good friend who came down with me, who was driving the jet ski for me on that last trip. I told them to him like the parameters, you know, of what I wanted to do and how I was going to restrain what I was doing to be safer. And he had to forcibly like enforce them at points, you know, whereas where I was trying to go back down that track of taking the crazy risk. And I think that helped heaps. But yeah, as far as relationship stress cause, it's going to be interesting going into the future. Like I've got to really manage that one well.
Well, make sure you keep
put that much anxiety on someone.
Yeah, well, make sure you keep your mate nearby so you can keep hitting those risk mitigators.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you're now a Red Bull athlete again, and there is a Red Bull documentary coming out soon. I think it's called The Other Side of Fear that you're starring in. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's built around my recovery from that last injury. Nice. And it's kind of highlights what I was doing before it and the crazy waves that I was riding and kind of mistakes I made that ended up putting me in that position in that wipeout. And then it's just going to it's snippets of, it's kind of like a whole lot of home videos of the tough moments of dealing with after the wipeout and the recovery. And then it goes into the nice stuff of making the comeback and getting married and having a baby and all that nice stuff. There's surf action in it, but it's kind of, I think it's going to be built in for more of a broader audience than just a core surf market, which is kind of nice. And I'm trying, it's like built, I think the way they've actually edited it is it's built that the underlying sort of storyline is a keynote that I deliver to audiences around the world. And that's like the underlying narrative. And then they're putting in all the pictures over the top of the keynote that I deliver with some interviews from people. So it's one of those things. I'm more nervous about that coming out than going to surf big waves again.
It's hilarious, mate. Well, look, this has been a fascinating and inspiring conversation, I'm sure, for a lot of our listeners. I know people can find you on Instagram over at Mark Mathews Surf, but is there anything else we should be sharing with our listeners in terms of finding you online?
My website is markmathews.com. It's just kind of, if anyone wants to reach out and they need a speaker for a corporate event or any other event. And then, and on LinkedIn, I almost do more stuff on LinkedIn these days than I do on any other social media. So if you want to reach out, ask any questions, feel free to send them through to me on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, I'll link up all that stuff in the show notes for our listeners. Definitely would make a very inspiring keynote speaker, not just face-to-face, but nowadays via Zoom, no doubt. You've got the awesome background. You've invested all this money in technology to do these online talks, so let's get them going. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, Mark. Hope you enjoy the recovery. Obviously, you have recovered, but hopefully you get back onto those big waves without putting strain on your relationship and you come out the other side smiling. Thanks, mate. Thanks
for having me, mate. And I'll be interviewing you soon one of these days. I'm very interested to hear your story and how you become so successful.
I look forward to it, mate. Cheers.
Cheers.